Hello again, welcome to Social Psychology, Psychology 346, and today we're going to be talking about ethics in psychology. So the possibilities for research within social psychology are endless, limitless. However, there are some guidelines that we as researchers need to follow. And most of those pertain to the fact that we are conducting research on actual human beings. We strive to conduct objective research to examine how we interact with each other. But we also, as researchers, strive to conduct moral research. And we want to protect participants from harm, whether that be physical harm or emotional harm, as much as possible. And there are several different institutions and guidelines that are in place, such as the city research training, such as the IRB, APA, we'll talk about some of those in a minute, that are in place to help us conduct as ethical and moral research as possible. One of the foundational doctrines on ethical research is the Belmont Report. And this report outlines three primary goals that researchers should have when creating and conducting an experiment. The first is that of respect for persons. And the idea of respect is that participants should participate in the study voluntarily. They should not be forced to participate. And that they should be informed, and they should have to provide consent in order to participate in the study. They should be somewhat informed of what they're going to be doing in the study. Second is beneficence. In this, the idea is to do good and to do no harm. That the benefits of the study should far outweigh the risks of the study for the participant. This can be benefits directed towards the specific participant, but it also can be societal benefits. If this research is going to be benefiting society in some greater way, then some risks can be accepted for the participants involved, but not too many. There has to be a balance there. And lastly is the idea of justice, that participants should be properly compensated for their time and attention and effort in research studies. And secondly, that this research should yield some valuable outcomes, that something should come from the research that's being conducted. Shouldn't be the fact that participants are doing a lot of these tough tests and maybe risking their own lives for nothing. There needs to be some kind of outcome involved. So this doctrine, these institutions are in place because some people in the past did some very bad things, some things that put a lot of participants at risk. For example, in research outside of psychology, the Nuremberg Code was enacted in 1948. In part because of a lot of the research that Nazis were doing on humans, experimentation, some pretty nasty stuff. Additionally, there's some other research that has occurred within the United States, specifically the Tuskegee study, Tuskegee syphilis study, in which researchers in Alabama actually gave African-American sharecroppers syphilis without their knowledge and basically monitored them to see how the virus disease progressed. They did this without the awareness of the participants, so very not good, to say the least. Similar research was conducted in Willowbrook using hepatitis, giving people hepatitis without their knowledge and tracking the progression of the disease. So these are obviously horrible examples of experimentation on human subjects. There have been some less ethically sound research conducted within psychology as well. For example, the obedience research conducted by Stanley Milgram using asking participants to deliver possibly lethal doses of shocks to other participants, causing some emotional distress in participants. The Stanford prison experiments, where half of the participant group were told to be prisoners, the other half were told to be prison guards. That ended very poorly and led to some serious physical and emotional harm. And it kind of brings the question, yes, we are acquiring knowledge, specifically within social psychology about how people interact with each other, but at what cost? We need to be sure that we're not harming individuals in the act of acquiring this knowledge. And there needs to be a balance there of, yes, we want to know about this stuff, but no, we don't want to hurt the people in order to get it. But there are some reasons why researchers even attempted these type of studies. There are issues with conducting psychological research, especially social psychological research. issues of reactance, where people tend to, when they know the hypothesis that's being examined, tend to work to disconfirm it. They try to act in opposite ways as what the hypothesis might suggest. We might also see issues of social desirability, where people might not actually give truthful responses or answers to questions that are being asked of them, especially when they know that they can be identified and associated with that response. So for example, if I asked all of you, within the last 24 hours, how many of you have eaten? I'm sure all of you would raise your hand. If I asked how many of you have maybe had 3 beers, probably some of you might not raise your hand if that was actually true for you, given maybe some stigma associated with alcoholism. But if I asked all of you, all right, how many of you within the last 24 hours have masturbated? I'm sure none of you would raise your hand. You wouldn't want to be associated with that type of behavior. You want to appear like you wouldn't do such a thing. So if for some reason you wanted to conduct research on masturbation, I don't know why, you would need to go about asking that question in a very different way than how I just asked it. Additionally, we can see participants have certain expectations of how studies might go. Maybe they might formulate their own hypotheses and then act in specific ways to maybe confirm the hypothesis. Or we might see what's known as the Hawthorne effect, and we might see that people are actually performing better when they're being watched by an experimenter. So sometimes experimenters need to disguise themselves as other participants in order to avoid these specific behaviors. And this brings up another point where oftentimes you'll see deception occur in psychological research. It can be used as a workaround to avoid some of the issues that I've just brought up. So for example, you might have cover stories given to participants to tell them basically the bare minimum details about the study, or maybe telling them completely different stories about what you're examining, different from what you are truly examining. If you do use cover stories, you will need to debrief participants afterwards to tell them about the true nature of the study. But these can sometimes work to help get around some of the, for example, social desirability issues. And this also brings up another point of risk. There are sometimes risks involved with psychological research for the participant. Ideally, you want to aim for minimal risk. This would be no different than the risks you would kind of encounter in daily life. This often involves asking simple questions, maybe completing simple problem-solving tasks, things of the sort. Sometimes you do see risks involved in certain psychological research. It might be physical or emotional risk, physical or emotional harm. So for example, there might be mild electrical shocks involved. There might be feelings of social rejection involved. There might be a cold presser involved, in which people take their hand and dip it into a bucket of ice water. These risks need to be basically told to the individual right off the get-go for the most part, and then they need to be debriefed about the true nature of these risks and why they need to partake in them after they've completed the study. Another type of risk that might not seem immediately obvious is identifiable data, being able to link an individual's name or ID to the data that they've provided in the experiment. Ideally, as researchers, we want to separate these two. We do not want to be able to link specific people to specific data. But in certain situations, in certain experiments, such as longitudinal experiments in which the same person is taking part in multiple studies over the course of, say, a year, we want to be able to connect the person to data so that we can see how the data has changed over the course of the year. In this situation, we need to be very careful about separating names from ID numbers and then having ID numbers associated with data. It's a little bit trickier, but it's something that needs to be considered when conducting this type of research. Additionally, all of this information has to be passed through an institutional review board, or IRB. This review board basically reviews all of the possible ethical concerns involving human participants' research, especially all federally funded research on human participants. These committees, especially within universities, are made up of a diverse faculty. In more business settings, they can be made up of some of the higher ups in the corporation. But they basically evaluate the ethical treatment of participants in every single experiment that is conducted within that institution. So an experiment, a study, cannot begin running participants or collecting data until they receive approval from the IRB. So those are some of the ethical concerns that need to be considered when not only conducting research, but also as you start to read about some of the research in social psychology, you can think about some of these ethical concerns as it might relate to the design of some of these studies. So thank you again for your time and attention. That's all we have today. I will see you all later. Bye.